So, I finished grading your first discussions, and before we go into them, I want to go over how I'm going to be grading pretty much everything. But I'm going to start with the discussion rubric, which I've already sent you, so you have a copy of this. All right, so I can tell that a number of you did not look at the sample discussion that I sent you, nor actually did you look at this. So I'm kind of going to go through some of the specifics here, not the least of which is that you need to be as detailed and give me as many examples as you can, right? And you need to have information from all of the required sources that you have for each week. Now, I'm going to go into what those are in a minute when I pull up the discussion from week one. But I'm also going to say, and I'm going to put you on notice right now, citation's mandatory. I sent you the how and when to cite guide. I've sent it a couple of times now. I've stated it clearly in the syllabus. I've talked about it. So here's the rule. For discussion week one and week two, since week two is already up, if you do not have internal citation, I will grade it, but you'll get a 0 for the citation, grammar, communication part. And starting in week three with next week's discussion, if you have no internal citation nor works cited, your post will be deleted because at this point in time, that is effectively considered to be plagiarism. At this point in time, you should understand about citation. It is mandatory to have both the internal citation, and you see right here, this is what I mean by that, that parenthetical cite where you've got the author and the date, not the textbook title, not anything having to do with a random website title. It is the author or the creator and the date. And if it's from a book, which Frankopan, Harari, most of the book sources we're going to use in here are actually from books, you'll have page numbers on them, then you have the author, the date, and the page number. And this comes at the end of every sentence where you use information from that source. So I've gone through your first discussions. I've marked everywhere that you needed citation. I've made comments. I highlighted everything that I said in the body of your top post and in your peer comments. I've highlighted everything that I've responded to in yellow. Now, there are a lot of you, so I haven't done a big in-depth thing, but once you start looking at it, if you have questions, email me, right? But anyway, I'm going to go through the actual discussion in a minute to talk about some things. But first, like I said, I just wanted to get through this. Here's an example of how to cite. This is a Strayer and Nelson from the 4th edition, not the current 5th one from 2019, and the page number. That's where I got that quote, right? And then in the works cited, this is the way it would look. Strayer and Nelson, Ways of the World, Volume 2, 4th edition, 2009, Bedford St. Martin's Press, right? All right. Wikipedia is not a valid source. I know they're working on it. I like Wikipedia myself if I'm just double checking to make sure my information about something is correct, but it is not an academic source, so you should not use it. You can use Britannica, you can use your textbook would be the best place to start, but anything that you use, especially when you're looking for that required multimedia source, you want that to be something that's actually academically credible. If you're watching videos, and I gave you a bunch of videos in this first discussion post because I knew a lot of you would be playing catch up on the information. The crash course videos are good. Cynical Historian's good. There are a number of anything from Smithsonian or National Geographic, any of the guys who normally do really good historical work, history.com, those are all good, valid sources. And you may use those for your multimedia. But remember, one of the last things you want in your top post is a paragraph comparing your sources, particularly their perspectives, right? And again, I'm going to talk about that in a minute when I get to the discussion of the first essay itself. All right. So generally, you have to have your top post in by Thursday with 3 peer comments on 3 different days, Thursday through Monday. So that gives you 5 days. Once you post that top post on Thursday, you can go to somebody else's post and read it and respond to it. And that counts as one on Thursday. Then that gives you Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday to get peer comments in, right? So you got 5 days, but you need to do one peer comment on 3 different days. A lot of you have them all on the same day with discussion 1, and I'm counting off for that because that's not the way we're supposed to be working on this, right? So again, I'm only counting your top 13, or I'm only counting your top 10 out of 13. So you're going to get to drop 3, and for most of you, I suspect this first one will be it. I actually kind of hope so because these were not great grades. All right, so this is the rubric. What I've done is I have copied and pasted your top post and then all of your peer comments into a document, a Word document. I have gone through them, like I said, marked them up, highlighted my comments, so you'll see where mine are. And then at the bottom, I've put this. Now, this is the basic rubric that I use. It's a 4-point rubric, but I'm going to point out right here, your peer comments are 1.5 points. So that's somewhere close to 40% of your grade on your discussions is based on those peer comments. So you can't afford to mess around with those, right? That is substantially the difference between a 90 and a 60, right? So you need those peer comments. All right, so in general knowledge, I base general knowledge on your textbook and on your multimedia, what actual general information you bring in, how well you support your arguments with historical examples. A 1 point on that, an excellent argument means you have nailed down a lot of the history, a lot of the comparative information, you've defended your positions with examples. Good is a 0.85, it's a B position. It basically means that you generally got it. You could have done more, but you got it pretty well. Basic means you might have thrown a couple of interesting examples in there, but you needed a whole lot more. And then, of course, below expectations and non-performance are pretty straightforward, right? Critical thinking is where I include or I look at what you bring in from the other required sources. For this first discussion, it would have been Frankopan, and it would have been those required videos, which I have in there. Again, I'll show you those in a minute. But yeah, there were a lot of sources for this one, and most of you didn't use most of the sources. So a lot of you got hit hard on the critical thinking thing because that means you're using all of the sources that are required, you're citing them in the body of your work, and you're doing that paragraph comparing those sources, talking about the perspectives of the different authors, right? And how they approach the information that you're talking about. Again, your peer comments, 1.5, again, the highest position. The A position means that you have responded to 3 people on 3 different days, and you've done so substantively. You've brought in more information that you did not put in your top post. You're not just taking the same ideas from your top post and copying and pasting them into a peer comment. This is new and different information. It demonstrates to me that you are well-rounded in your knowledge, that you haven't just answered from your perspective on the top post, but you're also bringing other information that you didn't use originally into responding to other people. It can either feed off of what they have, or it can, I don't want to say contradict, but you can bring an alternate perspective, right? If they spend all their time talking about the textbook, you might say, well, Frankopan talks about this, and that might have been something for you to think about in that top post. Or if you had a really good multimedia piece that you liked a lot, you can bring that into your discussion and say how it either complements, expands on what they're talking about, or how it brings another position into it, right? So that would be a 1.5. Substantive, lots of examples, lots of citation in those peer comments as well. You need that works cited, and you need your internal citation on those also. A good or a B position on that is that you've got your 3 peer comments. They're on different days. You've got basic ideas, but you could have used more support, or you've got some support, but you could have used more, right? Basic, again, you didn't really do anything. You did a little something new and different, but not a whole lot. And then, of course, below expectations and non-performance. A lot of you got non-performance because you didn't do the peer comments, so that's kind of bad. Citation and clarity, again, the highest point here is going to be on excellent citation, mostly with your works cited and your internal comments, and very few grammatical mistakes. I can read through it. You've proofread it, so I don't have many typos that I have to worry about. Your subject verbs match. I understand clearly what you're trying to say. You're not using weird words. because you're paraphrasing from something else and you don't want me to know. Yeah, no, don't do that. So yeah, citation 0.5 for that. Anything below that means, well, the good position 0.43 basically means that you cited most of the time where you should have, but you missed a few, right? Then basic, um, bare minimum, and then below expectations and non-performance. All right, so what's going to happen is this is going to be copied at the end of the file with the numbers beside it, and down here where it adds up, I will convert it to whatever your actual grade out of 100 would be, and that's the grade that I will be putting in the grade book. All right, so let's go to then the first discussion, right? Here we go. So the world before Columbus, and the title here is significant. This is the way things were before the Europeans arrived in the Western Hemisphere, right? Your required readings for this particular one were the Frankopan piece, chapters 10 and 11. It was these videos as well, all of them, all four of them, right here. The Crash Course World History number 18, the Mughal Empire and Historical Reputation, Incan Origins, and the Rise of the West in Historical Methodology. Most of you used at least one of them, but you didn't use all of them, which is not really what required means. Required means, yeah, all of them, right? All of them. And one of the reasons I did videos this week was because so many of you are going to be using different textbooks, or you may not have gotten the textbook yet, even though you could have used the Cordis or the Berger, and I applaud those of you who did. Those are good books. Um, and they would have given you a good overview of the world as well, because there are a lot of places in the world at this point in time. So let's go down to the question itself. Again, right here, mandatory APA citation. This is going to link you to where you need to go for those, right? All right. What was the world like for the average person in 1500? Okay, the very first thing you have to do, those words average person that I have in quotation marks, that pretty much means you have to define who the average person was. And I'm going to give you a hint. The average person in 1500 was poor, illiterate, barely making ends meet, lived in an empire, and struggled to feed him or herself and his or her family. They had marginal medical help, if any. They had a very limited diet. They didn't move more than maybe 2 miles beyond their house. The average is actually about 1 mile. An exotic person might have gone maybe up to 5 miles away from their home. And they're living in the same home their parents lived in, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, odd and fun, right? So the average person's life was pretty mundane no matter where you were in the world. Most of you immediately glommed on to the merchants and the explorers and the wealthy. Why did you do that? Well, you probably did that because those are the people we have records from, and that's what you read most about in all of these sources we're talking about, right? All right, so the best place to live and why. Now, you've got a whole wide world out there. And if you watch those videos and you read the Frankopan, then you already know that the place where people had the most food to eat, the most choices of food to eat, even if they were poor, the place where their life expectancy was probably the longest, where they could anticipate that their children, the majority of their children, would grow into adulthood, was going to be somewhere like Ming China, Mughal India, or the Ottoman Empire. You could have argued, had you watched the video, that the Incan Empire in South America would have been a good place. You could have argued that the Aztecs in Mesoamerica, Middle America, Central America, they had a pretty high standard of living as well. You could have looked at places in Africa, particularly along the Swahili coast, along the east coast. You could have looked at parts of Western Africa, Mali and Ghana. Those all had very, relatively speaking, high standards of living. Of course, the wealthier you were, the higher your standard of living, because you had literally much more to choose from in the way of good, healthy food and medical abilities. In India, in this period under the Mughals, they were already doing cataract surgery. In China, they were doing brain surgery. I mean, these were all really excellent dentistry. Um, these were all, though, pretty much things that were for the wealthy and maybe if you were in the very new burgeoning middle class. There's not a huge middle class. There's a larger one in those areas, but there's not a huge one anywhere in the world at this point in time. All right, worst place to live and why? Well, it depends. If you were in um, certain areas, there was still chaos. There weren't big empires controlling parts of Southeast Asia. There weren't big empires controlling whole parts of Amazonia or parts of Africa. But in terms of the world as we know it, probably the worst place to live was Europe. They were recovering from the bubonic plague in 1500. The bubonic plague had gone on a century before that. They were in pretty much perpetual warfare. The French and English had just finished the Hundred Years' War. Spain was going through, well, it was just recently united as of literally like the 1490s. No, I'm sorry, 1470s, right before Isabella and Ferdinand sent Columbus on his way. Um, Basically, they had very unsanitary conditions to live in. Poverty was rampant. You still had all the peasants and the serfdom still ongoing. People tied to the land have to do what they were told to do. Um, Forced Catholicism. This was going to be one of the things in Spain, was that the Spanish were unifying under the Catholic Church, under the premise of running everybody out of Spain who wasn't Catholic and who wasn't their form of Catholic, not just any Catholic, just theirs. They had a very militant Catholicism, and if you didn't do what they said, then they literally drove you out of the country or killed you. Right? This is the period of the Spanish Inquisition. Um, So, yeah, probably I would argue probably one of the worst places to live would certainly be Europe. Life expectancy was lower, quality of food was lower. I mean, one of the big reasons the Europeans are out there exploring is because their wealthy people want to start bringing into Europe all of these things that they experienced when they were on the Crusades and that they've seen by way of the Ottoman, Venetian, Genoese trading across the Mediterranean. And I'm talking about things today we take for granted, like pepper. They didn't have pepper. Can you imagine how bland the European diet was without pepper, without any spices? I mean, basically, they had garlic, onion, and don't get me wrong, I love garlic and onion, but that was pretty much all they had, garlic, onion, and salt, and they didn't have that everywhere. So, yeah, it was a really bland diet. They also wanted things like Chinese silk. They wanted um, all the different kinds of commodities that they could get out of the West. And originally, this is coming from the wealthy and the elite in Europe. The Italians, who never actually quite go into the um, period of educational remission we refer to incorrectly as the Dark Ages. The Italians stay pretty much connected to the rest of the world from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire onward, and they become kind of the center point trade hub for the rest of Western Europe. Sorry about that. Um, and especially once they reconnect and start trading with the Ottoman Empire, and they're moving all these goods that are coming along the various different trade routes, collectively known as the Silk Road, people want more of these things in Europe, right? All right. So, who had the highest standard of living, and what does that mean? Well, most of you nailed that. The standard of living has to do effectively with uh, the amount of money per person in an area, where they live relative to what we call today the poverty line. And again, those are probably going to be the places like Ming China, Mughal India, the Ottoman Empire, perhaps the Safavid Persian Empire, um, those areas along the Central um, Asian trading network areas, right? How did Western Europe compare to the rest of the world? Well, we just kind of went over that. It didn't really. It really wanted into those trading networks, but it was too costly to do it overland, which is why they began to look towards the sea. Now, a lot of you started talking about technology and how Western Europe had all this great technology. Let's look at something right here. Those are models of boats. The big one in the back was one of Zheng He's flotilla, of which there were thousands in the middle 1400s, that he used to sail from China around to India, to Africa, and there's some people who speculate that he even got as far as the Western Hemisphere. That boat took 3,000 to 5,000 people to work. It had room for all kinds of provisions. It had rooms for all kind of trade goods, and this was only one of thousands of them that he had. The tiny little boat in front is the model of one of Christopher Columbus's boats. When you want to start talking to me about advanced maritime technology, don't throw Europe at me. This picture should show you right there who had the best maritime technology, especially if they got from China to the Western Hemisphere. Zheng He and his flotilla, the Chinese win hands down, right? The Europeans basically lucked into a lot of what they did. Now, I will point out the period we're starting with, the Chinese are the guys who created gunpowder. So when you start talking about firearms, well, who do you think has the best firearms? You really think that it's the Europeans? In the 1400s, 1492 to effectively early 1500s, if a European had a firearm that they could carry on their body, commonly referred to as something like a blunderbuss, there was a 50-50 probability that when they shot it, it would actually backfire and hurt them or the people around them. This is not great technology. In fact, when they actually arrive in the Western Hemisphere, they, within a pretty short period of time, do away with their own metal armor because it's way too freaking hot and start wearing the woven cotton armor that the Incas and the Aztecs had because it was more effective. It was more likely to stop projectiles coming from European guns than European armor was, right? So when we start talking about technological advances, let's be very sure we know what we're talking about. Now, I'm not going to say that by the 1700s the Europeans haven't caught up, because they have. But by 1500, there's no way. 1500, your technological expertise was all over towards what we refer to as the East, which is part of why I bring you to that very last question about why do we tell the story of history from the perspective of the West? Well, effectively, we do because the West won. History is indeed written by the victors, and it always has been. You can go all the way back to some of the very first histories written all the way back in the Third Dynasty of China, way back when the incoming dynasty, the Zhou, had overturned the Shang, and they needed to justify their right to rule because they had taken away the right of the dynasty before them. They do this by effectively writing a great big history talking about all the ways that the Shang failed in their obligation to take care of the people, right? History's always been effectively written by the winners. And of course, we here, as some of you did rightly point out, coming from a Western European heritage here in the United States, we still view it from that perspective. A lot of you are going to throw the Renaissance at me. Well, there's a big argument that the Renaissance only affected the very wealthy, and it only affected a very slight percentage of the people in Europe at that point in time. What it does do is it lays the groundwork for the scientific revolution, Again, though, even with the scientific revolution, most of what they were doing was just picking up ideas from the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks and experimenting with them again, basically rediscovering what the Romans and the Greeks knew and what the people over in the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Empire and India and China still knew. They never lost touch with that information and they'd been building on it for centuries. Um, where we actually see Europe getting ahead is with the scientific revolution once you get to Newton and physics and that sort of thing. Um, and with the idea of the scientific method. We'll talk about that more over the next couple of weeks as we go into it. But I think it's important to understand that in 1500, Europe was well behind the rest of the world in terms of where things were, right? All right. So with all of that in mind, I will return to you, for those of you who did it, your first discussions graded. I encourage you to look at my comments, especially since at this point in time with discussion 2, you still have today and tomorrow to salvage some of the stuff by putting stuff in your peer comments, right? And be sure you get those peer comments in 3 different days. And again, starting as of next week, week 3, which starts literally this coming Tuesday, if you post something without internal citation and your works cited page, I will delete it. Because at this point, we're now 3 weeks in and we're into the realm of plagiarism. So you absolutely must use your internal citation and you must use your works cited in your top posts and in your peer comments. All right, if you have any questions, email me, let me know, and we will try to do more with this over the next few weeks. Thank you.